The island of Cuba is currently facing the worst existential crisis that it has ever faced in its history. With the world distracted by other headlines, an unprecedented population implosion has been unfolding on this island. At the start of 2020, Cuba's population stood at about 11.2 million. Independent observers estimate that as many as 2.75 million people have left since then, nearly 1 in 4 in just 5 years. Even the government's own lower figure claims 14% of the population has departed, which would be the second fastest decline anywhere this decade, behind only wartime Ukraine. Officially, authorities now say the island has around 9.7 million people. A leading Cuban demographer estimates it may be closer to 8.25 million. Why are so many leaving? A collapsing economy and crushing daily reality. Since 2018, Cuba's economy has shrunk by at least 15%, according to official data. After the pandemic began, inflation exploded. In 2019, the peso traded at 20 to 1 against the dollar. By November 2025, the informal rate was around 450 to 1. That implies an annualized inflation rate near 68% for 6 straight years, shredding savings and paychecks. A human rights observatory based in Spain estimates that 89% of Cubans now live in extreme poverty. 7 out of 10 report skipping at least one meal a day. Only 3% can find the medicine they need at pharmacies. Official unemployment sits at 12%, and 78% of people surveyed either want to leave or know someone who does. The government's own data puts the average wage at just 6.56 pesos per month, which is a little over $14 at the informal rate. Meanwhile, a carton of 30 eggs costs about 2,800 pesos, roughly 43% of that average monthly wage. A kilo of rice and a kilo of beans, staple foods, cost around 3 full days of labor. Fuel and power are a daily struggle. Gasoline shortages are chronic. Drivers wait weeks for a ration 40 liters that cost about $46, often several times a typical monthly income. Highways have emptied. In rural areas, people are turning back to horse-drawn carriages because there is no fuel. Public transport in big cities has slowed to a crawl. Blackouts are the new normal. Since 2020, island-wide outages have swept across the country. There were at least 5 nationwide blackouts in 2025 alone. During the summer heat, the power can go out for 4 hours a day across much of the island, and some less populated provinces can be without electricity for up to 20 hours. Research by a Cuban economist shows that Cuba is producing about 25% less power than in 2019, and outages are increasing. The grid depends on oil and aging diesel plants. Roughly 83% of electricity comes from burning oil, and about 60% of that oil must be imported. For years, Venezuela provided the Lifeline. In 2021, it supplied more than 100,000 barrels per day, enough to cover most of Cuba's needs. But as Venezuela's own crisis deepened, shipments plunged to around 16,000 barrels per day by 2025. After the US military captured Venezuela's president in early January, the US administration threatened to cut even that last trickle, putting more shortages and longer blackouts on the horizon. Tensions with the United States have surged again, with aggressive rhetoric from Washington. Analysts are asking whether the communist regime that has ruled for 67 years is closer than ever to collapse. Yet the world has heard predictions like this before. In the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, many thought the end was imminent, and the government endured. To understand why this island holds on, you have to look back. Before the revolution, Cuba was ruled by the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. He seized power in a military coup, suspended the constitution, and crushed civil liberties. Corruption was rampant, foreign companies and the American mafia had free rein, and up to 20,000 people were killed during his rule. That repression helped propel Fidel Castro's revolution to victory on New Year's Day 1959. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 then turbocharged the shift. The CIA-backed Exile force landed, the plan fell apart, and Castro declared himself a Marxist-Leninist. The US severed relations and imposed a sweeping trade embargo in 1962 that has lasted more than 6 decades. The United Nations has called for its end in vote after vote. Cuba and the UN have estimated cumulative economic damage into the hundreds of billions. With the Soviet Union as patron, Cuba traded sugar for subsidized oil and built up social services. The literacy rate soared from about 68% to 96% within a few years. A universal healthcare system produced some of the world's highest doctor-to-population ratios. At the same time, private enterprise was dismantled, property was seized, and waves of disaffected citizens left for the United States. Hundreds of thousands departed through early exoduses, freedom flights, and the Mariel boat lift. Over decades, South Florida became a second Cuba. Today, around 2 million people of Cuban ancestry live in Greater Miami, a community whose economy now dwarfs the islands. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba entered the special period. Trade and output crumbled. Another wave of rafters set sail in 1994, and US policy shifted to wet feet, dry feet. Tensions spiked again in the 1990s with shootdowns and bombings linked to Exile militants, and arrests of Cuban intelligence officers. A new lifeline arrived when Venezuela's leadership changed in 1999. Oil flowed at subsidized rates, doctors and security help flowed the other way, and even resales of oil brought in hard currency. At the peak between 2008 and 2015, around 100,000 barrels per day kept Cuba's grid and industry afloat. Then came a brief thaw. In 2014 and 2015, ties with Washington were restored, embassies reopened, travel restrictions loosened, tourism surged, and the economy grew by more than 4% in 2015. That opening closed fast. In 2017, US policy reversed. Travel was restricted, remittances were capped, embassy staff were cut after reports of Havana syndrome, and Cuba was placed back on the US list of state sponsors of terrorism at the end of the term. The pandemic then wiped out tourism, slashed remittances from $3.7 billion to $1.1 billion by 2021, and exposed deep structural problems. A powerful military conglomerate in Cuba known by its acronym GAR controls a large share of the economy. Reporting has claimed it oversees at least 40% of activity and stashes $18 billion in assets. Those reports also say that the funds needed to secure priority medicines and maintain the power grid are within reach, yet the money is not allocated to those needs. Meanwhile, key sectors have withered. In the 5 years up to 2023, sugar output fell by 68%, fishing by 53%, agriculture by 52%, and manufacturing by 41%. By 2021, protests erupted across the island and were met with harsh repression. Hundreds were arrested, and at least 710 were charged with crimes, including sedition. Nicaragua loosened visas for Cubans, and hundreds of thousands traveled north to enter the United States. During that presidency, an estimated 850,000 Cubans arrived. Now the pressure is building again. The US administration has returned to maximum pressure, guided by a Secretary of State of Cuban ancestry who has long sought the end of communist rule on the island. Venezuelan oil shipments have dwindled. The government in Havana is led by Miguel Diaz-Canel, with Raúl Castro still wielding influence behind the scenes at 94. A succession crisis looms when that old guard is gone. Military intervention in Cuba appears unlikely for now, partly out of fear of triggering a Haiti-style collapse and an even larger wave of migration to US shores. The more probable path is more of the same. Sanctions, embargoes, pressure on oil supplies, and the hope in Washington that economic pragmatism and political concessions will come in exchange for relief. So the question remains. Does this crisis finally end the system that has survived for nearly 7 decades, or does Cuba once again defy predictions and carry on in the dark? And if millions have already left, how many more will go before the lights come back on?